You can never perfectly solve a customer's problem, or I think especially with big customer base. What you can do is build something that's amazing in the 80-20, right? Help 80% of users do things really well. An API is like a superpower for a developer, right? You're delegating some massive amount of work to a single URL, single call somewhere. Speakeasy is a modern tool chain for API development. We help companies build great APIs. It's almost better than natural language because it's more structured. You're driving a set of commands for the machine. The one thing I love about WhatsApp, and I don't know if you can call this developer experience, but you can just send the message and it's like an event system clearly where it queues it up for you and never fails because they ensure that it's going to get delivered.
They're embracing the limitation and coming up with a creative solution to solve that product problem.
You make APIs, they're great, and you make too many and it's so shit. Now we have a discoverability and like access problem. I'm really excited for more people to interact with APIs, and it's going to get easier thanks to agents, and you're going to be able to just type natural language and be able to work and get the power of APIs. I think tomorrow is here today already, but tomorrow I think it's going to be you pull up your chat window and your favorite AI product, the LLM, and say, my name's Sagar. I'm CEO co-founder of Speakeasy. Speakeasy is a modern tool chain for API development. We help companies build great APIs. A little bit more about myself. I actually started quite far away from the world of APIs. I studied physics and was on my way to doing experimental physics, probably doing a PhD, sitting in a lab for 10 years, solving PhD friends, and then took a turn towards software when I took a job in the Bay Area in the early 2010s and realized that I really enjoyed crafting products. So that kind of going from prototype to pixel, really understanding how do you build great products for customers to use, that really caught my attention. And since then, I've been quite focused on that. I've gone to working on firmware, software, data engineering, developer tooling, and most recently, API design and API tooling. Probably my most foundational software experience was working at a company called LiveRamp that I joined in 2017. At the time, they were a hyper-growth ad tech company in that late stage VC funding rounds and were growing tremendously. For those of you who don't know, they basically power on offline to online ad targeting, helping marketing teams at every company actually take their data on customers and in a very safe, secure way, match that data to online interactions and display ads in the right places. Massive market. It was super fun to work on, although the ad tech problem itself may not be the thing I'm most passionate about over my career. The problems that it exposed me to were things like doing this, at the time, the second largest on-prem to cloud migration that Google Cloud had ever done. We ran APIs at kind of millions, billions of requests a second, and developed tooling for a company that went from like a few engineers to hundreds of engineers. So really exciting time to be there. And they also gave me the opportunity to go out to London and help kickstart an early engineering team out there and kind of help a new business unit grow and build a business. And that's what really gave me the kind of confidence to go to a startup next, was the feeling that, hey, I could navigate these things about company building that's more than just product. It's about finding product market fit and hiring and all that good stuff. And that's really quickly my journey to working on Speakeasy.
Is there anything from your background in physics that helped you understand the value of APIs and investing in like an API startup to like focus on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in physics, the biggest takeaway, two things. The problems you solve in physics are really complex and fundamentally hard quantitative problems. And often the only way to find a solution is to find an approximation, something that is almost as good, that works in 99% of cases. A lot of software is actually quite similar. You can never perfectly solve a customer's problem, or I think especially with big customer base. What you can do is build something that's amazing in the 80-20, right? Help 80% of users do things really well. And so I think that experience with physics has stayed with me. I think the other thing I would say is It's very much an experimental field, at least the way I approached it. Of course, theoretical physicist. Being an experimental physicist means you have to go through that same process of building something, trying it out, retrying it. Startups are a lot of that. The faster you can iterate, velocity is your best friend. The quicker you could probably find an answer to what your customer and market wants.
I found that it's very similar based off my limited physics education. I've always been fascinated with Feynman and a lot of the writings of theoretical physicists, more just like how to think about the world, right? Jeff Bezos was trying to be a theoretical physicist, and then he just took like that compute in his head and applied it to the business world, right? Similar conclusion to you, where it's just physical moving objects in the real world, and then how do you represent that accurately in a software system? Like, I feel APIs are a pretty misunderstood term, and a lot of startups I've gone to, API just seems like a cop-out answer. So when you hear, oh, we'll just make an API, especially with non-technical partners, the API is just seen as this vague term. But like when you really break it down, like it is like the API is the fundamental building block of how systems talk to each other.
Yeah, I think it's a great differentiation to bring up, which is like API in a most general sense is just a contract. And I think that, as you said, is the fundamental building block of all software. I think the APIs that we work with and where I think the term overloading happens is really in the realm of what the market sees it as, which is you can build API businesses or products. What an API to the rest of the world is actually similar to the UX, user experience. It's this thing that you interact with and you get some value, you pay someone to use it. And an API is very much that. It just doesn't have a visual form. It has purely a data form. And so that's how I think about it.
The primary like listeners of this podcast are like product designers, developers, the odd engineer. And the purpose of what I'm trying to accomplish by even just doing this many episodes is to develop my taste. And my definition of taste is being able to bring some level of culture and perspective, like a point of view. You want to be opinionated when it comes to taste, because if you are like making like an opinionated decision based off of your knowledge of the technology or problem space.
Companies everywhere have talked a lot about Stripe's APIs or GitHub's or Twilio. There's a lot of companies where people refer to as a great API. And it's very hard to quantify that in a cogent way. It really comes down to like how easily as a developer can you grok what this API is doing for you? What superpower is it giving you? An API is like a superpower for a developer, right? You're delegating some massive amount of work to a single URL, single call somewhere. The better it delegates the work, the better it actually is an API. The less calls you have to make, the less finagling with setup and trial and error, the better it is at being a superpower for you. When Stripe came along and did the famous payments API, gave you a bit of JavaScript to throw into your product, and boom, you had payments. What it really was unlocking for customers was it was so quick and easy to create that value, to delegate that big task of submitting and managing a payment. That was the taste, right? The taste is like, how easily can you actually use this thing? We find it really gets granular. Like, you're a developer in TypeScript, how you're typing out the functions in your IDE, the way the characters are placing, how the parameters are being hinted to you, that creates flow for the developer. And creating that flow is a beautiful thing, because when it flows and it just works, it's like doing natural language, right? You're just typing out the API calls or the SDK calls, and it's just flowing your IDE, everything it's like natural language. It's almost better than natural language because it's more structured. You're driving a set of commands for the machine. You do get to the level of characters and how all that stuff happens. Yeah.
Going back to Twilio, for example, maybe one of the ways to codify if Twilio has really good taste in their API product, like they understand like what a good API experience is, like a good developer experience is like a successful enterprise, like B2B SaaS. It has to do with Who controls the budget of the sales persona you're trying to target? Is it the CTO or the director of engineering? I think Jira, Confluence is a perfect example of this. Jira is the default in most companies. Why? Because most executives grew up using Jira. They started their career maybe not using Jira, but like Jira started and it was one of the first mass market issue trackers. And a company like Linear comes out and you could say, Linear, how are you going to compete against Atlassian? They're huge and so entrenched as an incumbent. The founder of Linear actually just showed their recent town hall deck of which customer segments they're going after. Their segment strategy of who they're going to target year after year and how that's going to inform their roadmap leaned into that assumption. No, we're not going after the enterprise. We're going to go after our friends first. And the next year, we're going to go after small startups. And then the next year, we're going to go after like Series B startups and then add more table stakes features. 6 years later, they're just consistently executing on their roadmap where they develop fans and people are starting to switch over from Atlassian. So bad that Atlassian actually is putting pay-per-click ads on the Linear Google search to draw people away. They're starting to be a threat. And now they're like, okay, now we're going after the enterprise because we feel like we developed a product a certain way. They understand that the next generation of executives should grow up using Linear. So we're going to target these smaller startups, smaller companies, because the ICs don't get to choose using this tool. It's the director of product or engineering that picks these tools. If you can make their experience better, like the person actually has to sign the check, and they're having a great experience and they're like, we love using this tool because I don't have to think about it. It flows, it works with my technology. An API business like Twilio is going to do very well because there's a ton of alternatives, but they have a really great developer experience.
I talked to someone recently, Robert Ross. He's the CEO of a great company called PyHydrant, an on-call and incident management platform. And I was asking him what he thought was great developer experience. And he had a really funny and great take, I thought, which was great developer experience is, the way he described it was, he said it's tested by how well something works and how easy it is to use something on an airplane. Where,
Interesting.
Sure, you have internet access, you have other resources, but it sucks. Everything just has to work the way it's expected to. I guess he's talking a bit of like offline first products, but I thought it was really interesting. And he's right. The stuff I usually think about using on an airplane is the stuff I know is just going to work really well on my laptop. I don't have to deal with network issues. I don't have to look up information. It's just going to work. So often on an airplane, I'm left working with a Word document or just in my IDE, like with whatever libraries I have. I thought it was a very interesting take. And I know it's like promoting a bit of offline first development implicitly, but interesting to think about.
Like, think about being the WhatsApp team. You're in Latin America, India, their APIs for low internet bandwidth must be fantastic to create such a great user messaging experience. Because if I take Apple Messages to Kenya, for example, it struggles without a decent Wi-Fi connection. But WhatsApp, for some reason, it works. One bar. Works.
Yeah, like another one is Slack. So Slack really sucks on low bandwidth or on airplanes on your phone. The one thing I love about WhatsApp, and I don't know if you could call this developer experience, but you can just send the message and it's like an event system clearly where it queues it up for you and never fails because they ensure that it's going to get delivered. And I love the little 2 check mark things that they came up with. Somehow no one has replicated that, like no one has come up with making, like having these simple things to show, hey, it's delivered, or it's like you've sent it, but it's not delivered. Or like it's sent, but the user has not. You see that those states are marked so well.
Yeah, like your jobs, when the internet gets better, we will handle getting it to the recipient. That's taste right there. It's like understanding that they're embracing the limitation and coming up with a creative solution to solve that product problem. And I think that's wonderful. Where do you feel like when it comes to APIs, buy versus build, what I've been spending a lot of time trying to get better at is being familiar with all the API services. Luckily, through the podcast, I'm meeting a lot of their heads of product naturally. So I get to directly ask them was an unforeseen benefit of sticking to this for a long time. When I'm making my roadmap, if the job is to get something from Salesforce, there's Merge, which is a past guest on the show, the head of product there, Anuj. If you need to pull from your customer's HR data, we have the Rails for them to integrate their Salesforce or the Bamboo HR instance. And if I'm a product manager or head of engineering, I've found when I'm trying to show these services to my engineering counterparts of, hey, I think this would actually be pretty like helpful for what we're trying to do here. And they're like, oh yeah, but it's pretty easy to just do it ourselves or whatever. Like it being like a non-formally trained engineer, I joke that I'm an amateur engineer. I know enough to hack, but I don't understand the craft of engineering. But I'm like, hey, this buy solution seems good. I don't know how to evaluate it. Sometimes I'll set up their development environment, test it out myself. But even then, that's not enough to convince engineering to like adopt a buy technology. What are the use cases that Speakeasy handles where, let's say this is a sales call, right? I'm a PM and I need some way to expose our technology to a customer or a partner system. And where does it fit in?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the Merge example you provided is APIs have been around for a while. Merge did a really good job in the last few years, really helping shape the unified API space. And this idea of API for an API was really interesting to people. You make APIs, they're great, and you make too many, and it's so shit. Now we have a discoverability and like access problem. They went after that, we solved that. I think it's not directly answering your question, but an interesting area this is going towards is with the way that APIs are not fundamentally changing, but the way people are accessing them is starting to change quite quickly. And this question of how do I know what the best APIs and vendors are and what should I use? It's actually going to come down to which APIs provide the best tools for usage of their product. And today that's human tools, right? That's API doc, SDKs, self-service portals, support, how easy auth and API key management is. I think tomorrow is here today already, but tomorrow I think it's going to be you pull up your chat window and your favorite AI product, the LLM, and say, find me the best flights to fly to LA tomorrow that are within this window. And there's a bunch of APIs for Booking.com and Kayak that are going to be available to use, and they'll be available because those companies have invested in agent tools and the tools for agents and AIs to actually use them. Similar to how we have developer experience today, people call this DX. You're going to have some kind of AX or AXI, so ensuring that all these tools make these APIs accessible. You can already see it like a small push towards it today with Claude, with Anthropic's MCP, it's called Model Context Protocol. Simple schema-based system to dictate what a tool is, what an agent tool is. I think it's going to get easier and easier though. It's soon going to be something like a sitemap on a website, right? You'll have a well-known LLMs.txt file, some kind of file on a website that says, hey, here's everything this API or this product is making available to you as an LLM.
And for the listener, when I took a API course online, you could argue that like the actual like UI of a system is like a user-friendly version of that API. When I hit this button, it's interacting with the API of a system. If it's eBay or like Amazon's APIs, like you said, or like Booking's APIs, like hitting like the refresh button is triggering an API to query Booking system, right? There's this company called Travel Arrow. Anyone that's wondered, how do these super young like college students like start like a SaaS, like a Chrome plugin SaaS service that helps you find like flight deals? There's no proprietary technology under it. They're just remixing existing technologies into a novel, specific use case. And if anything, it's a really great tryout project to work at these big companies, showing like, hey, you guys don't serve this use case. And that's where acquisitions happen. Everything that we do in the interactive software is some kind of API, some kind of query to a system. And so the whole like concept of an agent, OpenAI agent, I saw a video where someone asked it to fill up their Instacart with a bunch of tasty Asian snacks. It took control of the screen, now the LLMs understand what the API actions are for the company. So they'll be able to find the correct UI interface action to trigger the API.
Yeah. One of the interesting things has been like APIs have always been the superpower for developers, but not for anyone else. We've been edging towards it. You start to have these iPaaS products like Zapier show up, and that started to bring the value of API to semi-technical people. If you could string together some calls, if you understood what a call request was, a little bit of JavaScript, you could get pretty powerful. Now we're getting to the next level, which is you don't need any of that. All you need is natural language. And if you can just articulate the information you're looking for, the API call is automatically determined. And so I think to your point, it's a really positive movement because it's layering on to what we already have and just making it more and more accessible. In some way, it's like growing the TAM or growing the market for APIs. In startups, we always talk about growing your addressable market. And I think this has just grown the addressable market for APIs.
That's like Zapier's like business models, like semi-technical people. I use Airtable and Zapier extensively and make my own soloware. And it automates a lot of the production of this podcast and project management. And the low-code technology is pretty powerful now. It could solve most business processes. You don't need to build revenue operations teams, use those tools a lot. It's almost like the segments a company like Speakeasy would be going after. The market segments are developers. They're the only ones that know how to read your documentation, abstract what it does, how to use it, and then they have to figure out how to implement it in the technology stack. But imagine if you weren't selling to a developer anymore and you're selling to semi-technical people. Hey, do you want to set up your own API? Use my product. I'm trying to do this and this. Come up with an API like SDK documentation based off of you interacting with my product. What was the core insight that made you feel like this is the type of product I'm going to invest in? What was like the origin story of Speakeasy?
Totally. I think I've always enjoyed picks and shovels products where you are foundation building block products as an engineer, someone who likes that kind of stuff. You love the idea of building components that people can put together to build whatever they want. A lot of engineers share that kind of interest. At LiveRamp, I spent a good amount of time building developer tooling, and one of the spaces I focused on was API design and API development, and really got into the weeds on how do we enable hundreds of engineers to build consistent APIs for our customers. It starts with an internal DX story. If you make the internal DX really good, usually external DX.
What's a DX?
APIs, if you make internal developer experience really nice, external developer experience is likely going to be Conway's law state. You end up shipping what your organization looks like. If your organization isn't set up well, or the product you ship to your customers is not nice. At LiveRamp, we built this whole DSL, this domain-specific language to actually write and build APIs. So our teams didn't need to learn OpenAPI and different protocols. They just had to learn our simplified internal language. And then if they wrote in that, we would actually take care of all the automatic code generation, how auth was set up, how it got deployed. And so we gave them this really simple interface to build APIs.
An example of shipping the org chart is any product that there's a pretty obvious disconnect. You could tell that certain departments ship separate things when you're entering data on one side of the product, but it isn't queryable on the other side of the product. So you have to redo work in data entry.
Yeah.
And so Speakeasy is an internal developer tool?
Yeah, it's an internal developer tool for companies that are building APIs. We help you ship these really nice SDKs and other artifacts. We give you a modern tool chain for listeners familiar with products like MuleSoft or SmartBear. We're the modern version of that. We give you an end-to-end open API and API development tool chain. One of the critical things that comes out at the end of it is your SDK, which is we've been promoting this idea that APIs should be SDK first. Is think about how the API is used in Java, Python, or TypeScript, and you get to the next level of developer experience. And that's where we're coming from. And we've been pushing that idea. Speakeasy is a tool for you. Let's say your company had an API. You would use Speakeasy, build API, ship an SDK, ship docs, add tests. Pretty soon, other stuff we do, webhooks. things like that. But the end user benefits. So that's the motivation, and that's what Speakeasy has ended up becoming.
Yeah, like personally, in the past 2 gigs, every company I've been at, there's always been that discussion of, wow, we have way too many interdependencies between the departments or like the different teams. And, oh, we need to do a service-based architecture. We're going to make microservices. Like it's happened so many times, especially companies that are like hitting the 10-year mark of being alive. Like the product has so many interdependencies, and they're like, Amazon does this, but Amazon took 3 years of pain to get to services-based architecture. Luckily, they were able to take that and turn it into AWS, but most companies don't have that much time. And so it sounds like Speakeasy is like, you could start out as like just an internal way to potentially create like the reduce interdependencies between teams by developing better like PI shorthand, like Speakeasy. Okay, I see what you're doing there. A shorthand, but then you could roll that into external facing documentation. You could start with it just to allow teams to talk to each other without having to coordinate big interwoven technical implementations.
Yeah, exactly. I think we see a lot of the super kind of interwoven technical implementations at companies where the API has grown as a legacy product over many iterations. To give these companies credit, they are doing really well. They're good businesses. The API is very valuable. Not all of us can foresee how our company is going to change over time and what structure the organization takes. And so as the product team shifts and the company changes, the API shape kind of changes organically. I'll give you a really simple example. One team has authentication for the API using API keys, and the other one has OAuth or bearer tokens or something. And it's a slight difference, but for the end user, when you're implementing and you're going back and forth between two endpoints in a single API or two resources in a single API, you suddenly have different auth, right? And that's jarring. That makes the implementation process less seamless. You can't have a single auth. Like when I go use GitHub, one of the beauties of GitHub is I have a single GitHub user. I can generate a token and just sign all the permissions I want to it. And that's a stable token. They call it a personal access token, right? And that's a really nice conceptual model because I can now attach permissions to it. I can remove it. A lot of APIs don't have that, right? And you end up having a variety of authentication schemes in a single API.
What engineer on which team implemented that technical implementation 2 years ago? They don't work at the company anymore. That is
Yes.
the exact Conway's law. Like teams try to go fast, but then they create these dependencies and more convoluted implementations to compensate for the legacy software. And yeah, that's pretty crappy. Like, why is it so hard? Yeah, obviously there's tools like Speakeasy, but even if you implemented the software like Speakeasy, how does it make getting off that legacy product easier? What does the first 90 days look like of implementing Speakeasy? Or maybe the challenges you found in implementing a tool like this for the customer?
Yeah. So I think the first 90 days of usage with Speakeasy, what success looks like. Success often looks like you have probably launched your first SDK with us, which is to say you've shipped a library using Speakeasy, which allows developers in a particular language to make use of your product, use of your API very easily. And so often the biggest issues we run into is like our product ends up taking the modeling of your API and converts that into libraries of code. We do code generation and create code in different languages for you, the structure of your API or the design. We can help guide and influence it, but with legacy APIs, at the end of the day, we're just reflecting what you have into code used by developers. Sometimes the biggest challenge we run into is helping customers navigate neglected API descriptions and design and schemas, which need to be updated to get a lot of value from us. A lot of this is getting easier with LLMs. We have tooling, kind of design time tooling that we provide. There's open source stuff. But often it comes down to the fact that API design is a really hard problem. And we can guide, help, and influence, but ultimately it's really important companies have an owner internally that actually deals with API design and thinks about it. Yeah.
Okay, so that goes back to, if I look on the Speakeasy website, it says that it's like OpenAI native, right? So it is like a agent first experience, right? If you open up a Zapier or MuleSoft, it's very configuration heavy. People specialize their whole careers around using these low code tools. Did you see the opportunity, like why now for Speakeasy because of generative AI? It's hard because there's a lot of mundane work to actually execute it. Conceptually, it's, yeah, we need a unified API and we could design it using a technical design document. But when the rubber hits the road to actually execute the development work and the API, like that kind of stuff, like what's exciting about agent first experiences is removing the mundane. Am I understand that correctly? Would you say that's the big opportunity to do this now?
Yeah, it is definitely removing the mundane of API integration, right? As amazing as APIs are, it's a like $10 billion market. Some people argue it's a $50 billion market. There's a massive market that's appeared around API integration because API integration is hard. Zapier exists because integrating APIs is harder than it needs to be. The agentic world gets to the boring and lets us dive to the heart of APIs immediately, which is getting the data they provide rather than dealing with how they work. I don't need to worry about what's a required parameter and what's not. Let the agent take care of that tooling and the integration required to do that.
And you just need to provide it requirements like, hey, this is the intended payload of this API that should be pulling these variables, and then come up with a way to execute this. And then it's instead of like full self-driving, it's like super, like to think about like Tesla, it's like they have to supervise. They're making sure that you're supervising, like their interaction design is, hey, you're looking at the road. You could let us handle a lot of the driving, but you need to be able to take the controls when necessary. I feel like that's going to be a huge part of agent experiences, checking to see if the user is making sure they're not doing something fraudulent. In the case of API development, supervising the work of Speakeasy and developing the execution and language of the SDK. For me, this is really exciting. Sagar, what do you feel hasn't been said that should be said in this conversation, and how could people find you? Because APIs are hard. I think that one of my hypothesis being is like, how do you resource a dedicated API team at a startup or whatever? It's like you're not gonna have like dedicated engineers. It's like always gonna be a side project. So I wonder if that's like where the agent technologies come in to help provide this level of like integration. Is there anything that you feel like has been unsaid?
I think with the agent stuff, the thing that I'm most excited for, that I'll just leave maybe listeners with, is that I'm really excited for more people to interact with APIs, and it's going to get easier thanks to agents. And you're going to be able to just type natural language and be able to work and get the power of APIs. Now, I think there's a lot of steps to get there still. Like when I'll just say that, especially in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, we're always thinking a little bit ahead and maybe hype a little. We definitely easily hype up the current situation, but really we're in like day zero. The first innings on this hasn't even started, right? We're on the whiteboard. Everything out there is largely a POC or a tool. The chasm to enterprise usage is very big. We work with customers today, big, huge enterprises that are still getting the basics right on API design. You need to do that to engage with all of this. API consumption is rapidly changing, but API building, API producing is not changing very much, which is an interesting dichotomy here. It's adding more pressure to do more of the same, whereas API consumers are evolving to a completely new place.
But yeah, you have to have business cases, like requirements of what your objectives are to even get close to developing an execution. That's why when people are saying AI is replacing most of the product management role, if you think the product management role is to write PRDs, then I guess yes, but how do we know that the output of that LLM is going to lead to coordinating engineering and giving context to stakeholders? How did he know the inputs to that prompt on chat PRD actually was informed by the right data? A lot of that stuff, AI is really good at automating tasks. It is not even close to automating responsibilities yet. And responsibilities, like there's a sense of accountability, like someone's in charge of this. They need to be held accountable. It's hard to hold ChatGPT accountable, especially if it's like it just doing what it was told. I think what you're working on is really exciting, and I'm excited to follow what you guys do at Speakeasy. Thank you so much for coming on the show. How could people find you and get in contact with you?
Thanks so much for having me on. I think this space we're talking about, really interesting. We're very much in the early days. In terms of getting in touch, very easy to find, speakeasy.com. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me on X, formerly Twitter, at Sagar_Bachu. From our speakeasy.com website, we have a Slack community link where you can jump in and talk to us anytime. Always excited to talk to people about APIs and what's coming up.
Is there any way to provide feedback on Speakeasy and try it out in like a pretty low committal way? Or
super easy. We obsess about the self-service and onboarding. So there's an ever-improving onboarding flow that you should try and give us feedback on. It's really fun, easy to use. We've got a dashboard you log in, and we have a free tier that you can get started on. You can, if you're a developer, you can use a lot of the value in the product to a CLI. You can get started on your computer with nothing more than that.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show. You have a good one.
Thanks, Ken.
Hey, listener, thanks again for listening to The Way of Product. As we power down today's session on the fusion of creativity and technology, let's solidify the energy you've gotten from our dialogue today. If you've gleaned insights or strategies that could turbocharge your projects, I have a small but powerful ask. Swing by the platform where you're hearing this and leave a review. Think of it as your digital high five to us. It's a fuel that propels this content to more creative technologists like you, amplifying the impact of the shared knowledge. So until our next interview, keep pioneering and pushing the envelope. Thanks again for lending your ears and your imagination to our community. Catch you on the next download.